So Chris, we're talking about invocation today. So perhaps you could just start off by explaining what is invocation.
Yeah, okay. Well, invocation, as you know, is an ancient cultural act whereby at a point of crisis, usually a hero, decides to call on the gods for guidance and support. It's usually he in this case, must follow certain protocols to not exactly supplication, but there's a certain distance between the invoker and the invoked. So I think that this cultural practice of the invocation has actually become much more powerful through what we now know as the computer, because the computer is a medium for invocation. So when you think about when you visit a website, you need to put in the secret code for the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator. If you correctly invoke the website, it will appear on your screen. And that act of invocation is kind of characteristic of the computer. And it actually describes what you do with a computer better than computation. You don't sort of sit down and say, I want to compute now. We don't even use that term. You say, I want to use the computer like it's a drug or something like that. But in fact, the act of invoking describes the act of using a computer better than the existing terms. So that's why I propose to think of computers as invocational media.
Let's just perhaps explore that a little bit further. You talked about the hero seeking the help of the gods at a moment of crisis, I think you said. In what way is engaging with the digital device a moment of crisis?
Yeah. The moment of crisis is when you're typically in a situation where you don't know something, where I want to find out about a new product, or I want to know about a place that I'm going to visit. And so the crisis is often very minor crises of ignorance or desire. And so in order to fulfill that desire, which is not necessarily a lack, it can often be a productive type of desire, there's the act of invoking a response.
So this metaphor of invocation gives the computer a godlike status in this metaphor.
To a point. I think the thing is that the invocation is very abstracted. There's a certain mystery or a black boxing of the computer that means that, in fact, with contemporary devices, nobody knows what the full detail of the computer. Whereas, say, with clockwork, it would be possible to break down all of the actions of a clockwork apparatus and to fully understand and fully comprehend what is how the machine is operating. But with a computer, the work of so many people involved, the dead labour of all of those programmers and engineers, means that nobody knows what an invocation is going to produce. And so it is, I wouldn't say there is a single conceptual persona, a single godlike entity that you're invoking, but there is a dimension of faith and operation when you invoke.
Makes sense. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, and because of the power of the computer and the transformative experience of using these devices in our lives, it seems as if there's a qualitative difference today.
Yep. So before computers, in fact, the typical history of computers is a history of abstraction, mathematics, and logic. But I think that computers have a different history, which is the history of invocatory devices, which translate material effects into a minimal operation. So for example, with a bow and arrow, the bow and arrow invokes the force of the kind of leverage of the bow so that it's possible to make a decision at a point of crisis again and release the arrow at that point. Or a gun, which invokes the power of the gun designer, the power of the gunpowder, the material power. Or the photograph is also an invocatory device. The camera is an invocatory device that will capture, again, a kind of a moment of crisis or of importance, of salience at a particular point. But the difference with invocational media is through the invocational diagram or the kind of Turing machine structure, you have the invocation of the fetch-execute cycle, where an instruction is read and then the outcome of that instruction is interpreted and enacted. And then at certain points, the user is able to intervene in that invocation and, for example, type the letter Q, at which point the actions of that invocation are manifest in the digital data environment, stored to memory. And in order to, the other thing that's sort of important about the computer is the stored program principle. The stored program means that everything is stored in memory, which includes the memory and the algorithms and the data, that both of which can be invoked. So either an operation can be invoked or some data. So when a person in office uses a spreadsheet, they can store their file on the computer and invoke calculations that give guidance about decisions, and usually for sort of financial decisions and so on.
And that storage is often referred to as the cloud, which kind of reinforces the notion of this godlike myth that you propose.
Yeah, no, that's nice. Yeah, so in invoking from the cloud, there's a sort of invocational imperative, which is that desire to make as much as possible invocable in as transparent a way as possible. And so the cloud is one of a series of higher and higher abstractions of invocable domains. So an invocable domain is an address space to which it is possible to address the invocation. And this address space is critical to, and it's what Heidegger refers to as standing reserve, because the symbolic data and algorithms, so processes and stored entities, are made addressable so that to enable the possibility of invocation. And the invocational imperative is to extend the invocable domain to, so Google wants to make all knowledge available. And so they digitize all the books. They drive cars around the world to make the street view invocable, and so on.
Right. Can we just go back to, you referenced Heidegger there and standing reserve. Can you just give us a definition of what you mean by standing reserve?
Yeah, okay. So Heidegger thinks about technology. He sort of dismisses a range of other approaches to technology, but he says that technology is about revealing. And he thinks that the modern way of revealing is a kind of impoverished or problematic type of revealing because as opposed to other forms of ontogenesis or of the formation of something that didn't exist before, which is sort of what technology is, that it reveals in certain ways that are more organic or pastoral. But modern technology stores up the world in standing reserve so that it can be brought into presencing. But once the modern technology brings things into presencing, it must store up the world in a way that makes it, in my terminology, makes it invocable. And so for Heidegger, he talks about the Rhine River being dammed up so that electrical energy can be invoked. And even the Rhine River becomes available to the tourist gaze. And so it's no longer, in Heidegger's terms, available in the diversity of possible ways of revealing. It is revealed in a very narrow and limited way. So when you think about computers have sort of become this universal machine, which means that it's possible to make movies with it, to perform calculations with it, to post selfies, and so on. But what that's done is taken a diversity of processes, so typesetting, photography, mathematical techniques, and so on, and it's reduced all of those into the single type of event, into single invocational event. And as Heidegger points out, we've actually lost things by reducing everything to the single sort of commodified version of revealing.
What would his alternative form of, because he himself was very much a philosopher of revelation in some sense, of connection. How would he then propose an alternative?
Well, his alternative is poetry, but he says that also the closest to the danger is the saving power. And this is quite a mysterious claim, and is sort of almost, he doesn't really define what the saving power would be. But I guess the saving power might be in artistic uses of invocational media that produce surprising or alternative manifestations of how invocation works. So things that actually disrupt the invocational relationship in a way that creates something new, what Deleuze might refer to as a line of flight. Not that he was a friend of Heidegger, but the line of flight, which is a movement away from the conventional ways of, I mean, the most common uses of computer are in large institutions that return the invocation to capitalism, to capital, or to the state. But there are, of course, creative uses. And in some ways, although selfies and memes and so on are often just cliches, they are examples of sort of demotic, everyday creative practices.
Okay. Now you draw on Austin, J.L., I think, Austin's model of, to describe what you call the invocationary act.
That's right.
I think it might be useful if, could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So Austin was a key philosopher and linguist who identified the fact that language typically doesn't just refer to things in the world, it actually does things. So he talks about the constative, which is the way that it just simply refers, and the performative, on the other hand, where language does something like make promises or come down with judgments, a judge in a court. And so there's three components that he identifies. There's the locutionary act, which is the act of speaking or composing a sort of grammatically correct statement. The illocutionary act, which is what happens when the promise is made or the judgment is passed. And that changes the world, or what Deleuze and Guattari would later talk about as the incorporeal transformation that is summoned by the invocation, the locutionary act. And then finally there's the perlocutionary act, which is the most mysterious of all of the acts, which is what comes about through that. So I am sentenced, but in some way the perlocutionary even extends into the act of imprisonment or the being held to the promise or the bet that you've made. Now the invocationary act actually holds those all together. So the locutionary becomes the input to the computer. The illocutionary, so for example, when you swipe your card to perform a transaction, it actually completes that transaction. So as opposed to the sort of promissory note of currency, it actually performs that process, and the illocutionary and the perlocutionary are actually contained in the invocationary act. So the act of invoking is very often making these important transformations, the incorporeal and even corporeal transformations.
Yeah, and so the world is changed through the act of engagement. As we look at speech acts, it also brings to mind the idea that digital devices are not merely about invoking the God of knowledge, so to speak, from the cloud, but also connecting with other humans. Mm-hmm. How does it help model and understand that kind of relationship?
There's quite a range of ways in which digital media create platforms for communication. You sort of think of platforms as something that you can stand upon to make speech. And the platforms can be quite complicated. So you have electronic mail, you have chat, you have Facebook. And each of those platforms establish a kind of, you can diagram those relationships. So there's the synchronous and asynchronous communication, where the diagram is of a real-time conversation with a chat or with a Skype call. Or with email, it's asynchronous, where you send a message, you invoke the other person with their email address, and then at a later stage, they can read and compose a response to that. So that invokes the mail system as a metaphor. Of course, it's an imperfect metaphor of mail, which is different from invoking the concept of the chat. Or Facebook creates originally a wall or a timeline, or I forget what they call it, and that creates a space for conversation of the news feed that updates a sort of selection of posts from your friends. And then they also have invocable events and so on. So all of those are different ways in which digital, invocational digital media create platforms for communication.
And of course there's also the live stream, for example, in which there is an instantaneous experience of distanced experience.
Yeah, and that's where the live stream moves from invocationary acts into invocationary action, because with an invocationary act, there's a sort of singular moment at which the invocation takes place. But with invocationary action, there's an ongoing process of flow and of control, whereby what is invoked is constantly invoked. And it's only at that point of breakdown where the stream cuts out, that suddenly you start to seek invocations again. So it's still invocationary action. It's still based on the invocation, but the edges of the invocations are not visible anymore. And that's even apparent in the GUI where you move the mouse across the screen. There are invocationary acts such as double-clicking on the hard drive or launching an application, but the action of moving around the screen is where the sort of action and your awareness of that action merge into a single ongoing cybernetic process.
Can you talk to that, a cybernetic process? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so cybernetics is the interdisciplinary field of feedback and control. So a cybernetic relationship is one where, the classic example is the thermostat, that when the thermostat senses that the heating in the room has reached a certain point, it will turn off the heating, and then when it gets too cool, so it preserves homeostasis. But that homeostasis, that state of homeostasis, is the opportunity for people to seize control. So the term cybernetics actually comes from the idea of the steersman, which is steering a boat across a river and compensating for the current to move against the current in a certain direction. So the rowing and the steering will be not in a direct line, but will compensate for that movement. With moving a mouse, moving a cursor across the screen, your sort of will or your desire directs the cursor across the screen, and you have a feedback between your eyes and the movement of the cursor on the screen that is cybernetic.
Right. And presumably advances in technology will eventually eliminate the physical mouse and allow us to have a much more embodied relationship to the device.
Well, there is a recent development, which is the sort of brain-computer interface. One of those devices allows you put a patch on your cheek, and the computer senses what you're saying. But in fact, it can sense what you're saying without you actually saying it, because it takes the muscles the muscle impulses for your speech and converts them directly into text. So it becomes possible to invoke without a voice at all.
Wow. It's amazing. Yeah, okay. So can you explain how you feel from an ethical dimension? Where do you situate? Is this a neutral act invocation, or does it have ethical dimensions as you understand?
I guess one of the political dimensions of the invocation is who controls the infrastructures and the codes for invocation. So, and there is a tendency towards monopolies of invocation, which means that first of all, IBM controlled the whole computing industry, apart from a few much smaller companies. IBM was who you went to own computing. They owned what computing was. Microsoft came along and they controlled the operating system in personal computers, and they used that to their advantage to dominate software more broadly. And then Google became the one place that you go to do your search, and they monetized that through advertising, and they sucked advertising away from traditional media, so that they became what Mackenzie Walker refers to as vectoralists, which is the type of power that comes from controlling the vectors of communication. So there is at the moment a kind of controversy about the power of companies like Google. There was a lot of court cases against Microsoft. So this danger of monopolies of invocation is one of the things that comes with invocational media.
Mm. And how does that relate then to authoritarian states, which have much greater control over the media than, say, Australia?
Yeah. China is really the case in point of a state that's making use of invocational media with the face recognition systems. So it's possible that in China, if you step out from the curb to attempt to jaywalk, that there'll be a camera that captures your face, a sort of involuntary invocation, and will present that on a large screen and shame you and name you literally. And there's also what's called a social credit scheme, which is a large kind of database that performs judgments, invokes judgment upon you depending on what you consume, what political actions you take, and so on. And where your privileges are actually defined by that database, by your kind of social credit score. And so that actually limit your own powers of invocation. And so certainly that idea of social sorting, where invocational media can distribute and constrain your capacity to invoke, your capacity to travel in China, can be determined by your social credit scores.
Yeah, disturbing scenario. You talk then about involuntary invocation, and that, of course, is not just in states like China. It happens all the time. We're constantly being captured in various ways. Can you talk to that?
Yeah. An invocation is always to something over which you don't have control. It's a sort of a form of supplication, and sometimes, like in the example of face recognition, but also in a Google search, you often involuntarily provide information to Google about they profile you in performing an invocation. So giving a search, performing a search, also creates a trace of that search and allows Google to advertise more precisely to you, to create a profile of you. And that is, they try to tell you that this is a voluntary decision, but of course it's not, because they have totally asymmetrical power.
So what is the response? You paint a kind of dystopian nightmare with that kind of image.
Yeah.
How should we respond? How do people respond currently?
Well, the thing about invocational media is, for the most part, it is voluntary. And whereas Shoshana Zuboff's sort of idea of surveillance capitalism points to all of those dystopian claims, it leaves open the question, well, why would people want to subject themselves to this? And for the most part, people do actually get value out of invoking. They do have access to more knowledge than was imaginable 20 years ago. They do have the capacity to be creative with digital cameras, with their mobile media. They are able to communicate with people in ways that were previously economically and practically impossible. So there is the saving power closest to the danger. But I guess that's where what becomes important is activism and critique of the specifics of how invocational infrastructures are organised. And it's possible, because Walk talks about the vectoralists who control the avenues of invocation, but he also talks about the hackers, and the hackers for him are the class of people who create hacks that create new forms of becoming, new forms of invocation and other types of cultural practices. And so there is scope for both resisting, which is, I think, important, but also for creating something new in the invocation. So I wouldn't say it's a totally dystopian or utopian concept of the invocation. It's always ambivalent.
In terms of creating new things through these, can you talk to any specific examples which you think exemplify these new forms?
I guess, yeah, digital art could be one place in which I think of Rider Spoke, which is Blast Theory's intervention, which is a bicycle ride that you take with a little digital device that gives you instructions on where to go. And then it asks you to stop and record a message that gets passed on to future users. And that allows you to experience, usually an urban space, in a different way. So if the platform, in that case, is a combination of the bicycle and of the digital recording device and the communication device, it's not an instrumental concept, it's a poetic concept of how to use invocational media to create something, create a platform that doesn't have an outcome that can be reduced to capital or finance or to state forms, but it's possible to create other forms. So, I mean, I'm not actually Heideggerian, but I think that kind of the poetic is one, but also in Marx's terms, the point is to change it as well.
And that kind of brings us back to the notion of the muse that we started off with, because the muse is what inspires the individual. Do you see a space for, we're talking about digital media as invocatory devices, but do you see a space for non-digital invocation in the contemporary cultural landscape?
Yeah. Invocational media is specifically a medium theory. So it is a theory that computers are invocational media. That doesn't preclude the space for other forms of invocation. And so people's sense of the spiritual, I guess, is not reducible to the invocational medium. And I wouldn't like the idea that the hegemony of invocation takes away the possibilities of other cultural practices that could be considered invocational.
It is a question, though, isn't it, whether the digital culture is a kind of a black hole that sucks absolutely everything into it, and if anything can actually resist. Because we're so, we're less than half a century into this culture, and who knows how things will progress, but one assumes that current trends will intensify.
Yeah, well, there is that idea of, that the invocational imperative, which attempts to digitize everything, but in fact, making things invocable, in order to make things invocable, you have to massively slow them down. So sampling audio reduces the diversity or the kind of chaos of noise into selecting, choosing a microphone, hitting record, digitizing that, what I call the avocations that allow the invocation to take place. The avocations are the things that call you to invoke, but in order to invoke, you are actually reducing the complexity, the sort of infinity of chaos, and turning it into something that becomes invocable. And you then also experience, as a result of the invocation, the evocations that, again, become infinite, so that our voices being recorded become invocations, but then on the other side also enter into chaotic relation. So invocational media will never displace what's wrongly called the analog world, but the physical world. And the world of Sherry Turkle emphasizes the importance of conversation. So there are a whole range of cultural practices that will never and should never be translated into invocations. The idea of, for example, virtual reality, which the apparent logic of virtual reality is that ultimately we'll have virtual reality so perfect that it will be indistinguishable from everyday reality. But that's really a nonsense, a fantasy. The heterogeneity of everyday experience is still preserved. Even though I've got a mobile phone in my pocket, it isn't the sum of my experience. It is a facilitator, a vectoral force that allows us to have this conversation. So, you know, we made phone calls and emails to do this, but you can't reduce this conversation to an invocational relationship. So I think that fear of total invocation, of the spike that suddenly transforms the world so that everything becomes invocable, I think that's a myth.
Okay. You just referred before to avocation and evocation. Perhaps it would be helpful if you could just define those two terms for us.
Okay. So in order to perform an invocation, you have to form the desire and the knowledge that allows you to invoke. And with advertising, with manuals on computers, with software, with graphical interface software that instructs you how to perform an invocation, there's a range of forces that attract you and enable you to perform the invocation, which you then do. And there's a trade-off with the precision of the invocation and the power of the invocation. So if you're a computer programmer, your avocations are the very fine details of programming languages. But if you are performing a higher level invocation, those avocations can be much more determine how the invocation will take place. Once you perform the invocation react, the outcome of that is manifest through the speaker, on the screen. These are the technologies that DePaul refers to as the society of the spectacle. So you have on the one side of the avocations, surveillance, and on the other side of the invocation, you have the evocations, which is the spectacle. And you combine those into invocation reaction of the video game, where you're constantly called to control the game with your game controller, and the results are evoked on the screen in that cybernetic invocation reaction, and the evocations go out into chaos, where you don't make sense of the world of the game because it is in computer memory. You experience it as an invoked space that is also an evoked space.
Thanks for that. So we've covered invocation, avocation, evocation, and we haven't actually had vocation yet, just to complete the set, and the notion of a calling. Does that resonate with your thought?
Okay, so when computers were first created, it became clear that there would be a lot of work for programmers to create further invocations or invocational infrastructures and avocations that allow people to perform certain tasks. And that created the first vocation, which was the software developer. And that called if avocations are a kind of a minor form of calling, the vocation is a major form of calling to a whole life, a calling. And invocational media then started to attract other types of calling. So for example, the desktop publisher became a calling, and it called to the whole regime of kind of typesetting and so on, so that the desktop publishing package, like what now is InDesign, actually has a whole lot of avocations that allow you to lay out a page and to design and so those avocations combine to create the vocation of the graphical designer, or of the vocation of the video editor using Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro. Those avocations combine to form the possibilities for vocations.
Great. Okay, we've now covered everything that is on the map here, which is great. So I'll just end this part just by coming back to the image you presented before of the future as a fairly positive, non-dystopian future you were presenting. I must say, personally, I'm much less optimistic than you are, and I just wonder how you imagine the future of invocation, given the fact that we are so early on in this digital transformation.
I mean, at the moment, I'm doing research on robotics, and I think in robotics there is an ambivalence about the future of robotic invocation, because whereas most invocational media have offered the power of the user to enhance their power to perform invocations, the idea of the robot is that it creates alterity relations, which is that the robot becomes the other, and not something that enhances your power, but something that offers to become a surrogate, or either a servant, but also a police, the Robocop. And the question there is, if the future of invocational media is in robotics and dealing with invoked others, then who controls that robotic device? And certainly when that is likely to be in the military, in police, and so on, there are a lot of dangers. And similarly with artificial intelligence in the hands of the state and capital is about making judgments and distributing among populations. So I don't really want to underplay those dangers. I don't want to advocate a dystopia or a complete reaction or resistance. I do want to advocate a hacker mentality, or an activism that seeks to check the power of the monopolies of invocation. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm naively or completely optimistic, but I don't think that pessimism is the only answer.